Hey, I'm Chuck Mingo.
And I'm Hannah.
And we are in front of Mother Bethel AME. Yeah, we'll talk about why in a little bit, but this is part 2 of our freedom series. And in this series, we've been talking about the fact that Jesus has a countercultural approach to freedom, and it includes binding ourselves to truth. We tend to think it's about freeing ourselves from anything other than what we want to believe. But we're a couple of blocks away here in Philadelphia from where the Constitution was signed, Independence Hall. And if you think about it, there were a group of men who bound themselves to the truth of this document, that they crafted, that wasn't perfect, that needed amendments, but yet for hundreds of years, our country's been able to operate and basically be governed through the same document. And so we're gonna talk about what it looks like to bind ourselves to the truth of Jesus in that same way.
Yeah, and you talked, Chuck, we've had this conversation about the Bible is that for us, that if we follow Jesus, when we choose to follow Jesus, we don't necessarily, we have this constitution that is the Bible. We look to it as the ultimate truth. We bind ourselves to that truth. And you know, there's something to that concerning freedom. In the Bible, John chapter 8, verse 32 says, and they shall know the truth. You'll know the truth. Jesus is talking to a multitude. He says, and that truth will set you free.
That's right.
So I have to believe that he's talking about himself because he says also, I am the way, the truth, and the light. So if we bind ourselves to him, we bind ourselves to the truth of the word, that's who he is, that's when we experience freedom. You know, Chuck's actually getting ready to go inside of Bethel, and we're gonna learn a little bit more about why this place is so important. And he's gonna have the opportunity to talk to a special guest named Eric Mason, who's just an awesome guy who's gonna speak to us a little bit more about what it means to be free and how to get there through this idea of truth. I'm excited to hear what he has to say.
We're about to go to school, and we're about to go to church.
Yeah.
So I'm here with Pastor Eric Mason, and we're in a pretty historic place. Why don't you tell us about this place?
Well, thanks for having me with you also. This is Mother Bethel. Mother Bethel is representative of the oldest church, black church denomination in the country.
Not too far from here is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where a group of men at the time bound themselves to a document. Called the Constitution, and said that this is the way we're going to govern this nation. And right, wrong, or indifferent, obviously the Constitution is not the same as the Bible. It's needed amendments. The Bible hasn't needed any amendments, but there is this sense in which that binding to a truth has enabled this country to be governed for all of these years and enabled us to journey together on what it means to live out this thing called a democracy. Talk about what that feels like or what that means for us as people who want to experience freedom spiritually. What truths do we need to bind ourselves to kind of experience that freedom?
Yes, I think one of my favorite verses in the Bible on freedom is, for freedom, Christ set us free. Galatians 5:1. And so I believe that no matter what type of circumstance that we find ourselves in politically, geographically, or citizenship-wise, believers are always called to live under the theocratic reality of who God is, while at the same time being respectful of the society that they're in, and maneuvering and being connected where there's continuity, and being wise as serpent and innocent as doves when there's a lack of continuity with our walk with Jesus Christ. And so I think believers are always, I believe particularly now in the West, we're still trying to figure out what that means. Like even everything from protesting. You have some believers that'll say, protesting's unbiblical. You don't see protesting in the Bible. And I'm like, I see it everywhere. I like when Moses went to Egypt and said, let my people go, that was like a major protest. So I was kind of like, I'm kind of confused. When John the Baptist jammed up Herod, that was a protest. When believers got flogged in Acts and they said, we'll follow God, we won't follow you, and that was like a protest. And so I think that a lot of times we don't realize how culturally captive we are at times to being actually bound more into what's freedom in our culture versus what's freedom in Scripture. I think that we're always figuring out, how do we navigate culture and how do we honor God, be faithful to him, live for eternity, but live in light of eternity. We know when people say, don't be so heavenly minded if you're of no earthly good, the challenge with that statement is being truly heavenly minded is to be truly of earthly good. And so believers have to really walk in what that means. That means generationally. And so every generation particularly when you're a believer, when you're socialized in those different milieus, you're always trying to figure out how do I function in not only my ethnicity, but how do I function in my generation, love my generation, engage culture well, be a part of culture, but then also, how do I live out the reality of who Christ is in my particular generation? And that's something we all have to work through, wrestle through, struggle through, and be discipled through, and yet not be in the fog with, get clarity on.
Yeah. Because you're talking about, no matter what generation I'm in, there's cultural truths, but then there's these timeless truths that are a through line. So just some practicals. What would you say to people who are like, all right, I want to be free. I want to live in freedom. And I'm wrestling with this whole thing of binding myself to the timeless truth of Jesus. Where would you tell a person to start? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, one of the things that I think when you're trying to bind yourself to freedom, one of the things that you need people in your life that are in different phases. Your community needs to persist of several different types of people. You need peers. You need peer community. You need somebody that's in the next season that you're going to be in, and you need someone that's trans-seasonal. And so, and then eventually you need someone that's behind you in season so you can be a disciple maker.
So as you think about binding yourself to truth,
Yeah.
and what this place has meant, I mean, in some ways, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were people who chose to look at the cultural reality, but bind themselves to a different kingdom reality, which caused them to innovate, to create something that didn't already exist, right?
Yeah, I think, when you look at a place like this and you look at, what it represents, people always say, there's no such thing as the black church. I got a lot of layers to that, okay? So if you go to China, and we're ministering to, do we call them the church? No, we call a church based on its missiological incarnational milieu. It's a Chinese church. That doesn't mean it's being divisive or separating from us. It's just saying that's the culture that it incarnated in for the gospel to transform there. But when people don't realize, when they say there's no such thing as a black church, I always tell people, I said, well, there wouldn't have been a black church in America. But when the white church decided not to be the church, it was a necessity that there be a black church. And so the division starts from the inconsistency of not seeing one another as the same. As a pastor, no pastor will get in a counseling session with somebody, or even a counselor that's worth their weight in anything, wouldn't get in front of someone and act like their past doesn't exist. The person in front of you is the sum total of what they've been nurtured in. And so one of the things you're going to ask is family history. What's your family history? Because the family history helps develop that person into the person that's in front of you, so that as you understand that helps the pieces of not just saying everybody's fallen, how are we falling? What's the circumstances of our fallenness? And so that's what we have to do in the Church of America. The Church of America Church of America needs counseling.
We got to do our family history.
We need counseling, number one. And we need family history. The whole church needs counseling. Because we don't realize that our dysfunction comes from our unwillingness to look at what created the existence of what's here today. So if we begin saying, listen, we're not going back in the past to guilt white people. We're not trying to, Jesus is an expiation. He frees us from the guilt of sin. But however, in order to look at, we have to open up some ugly stuff. That's why lamenting is important. Lamenting being added to the framework of our worship, because lamenting makes you pause and not rush past trauma. And a lot of times people rush past. The problem with America, because we have a triumphalistic disposition, we rush past trauma, and we don't realize that stuff that shouldn't hurt us hurts us because you're hitting a spot in your life that you haven't dealt with fully, so that you can move forward in life. And that's why we keep getting traumatized every time a black man is killed in the streets. We get traumatized every time something in our country happens as it relates
to... We don't stop, pause, lament, feel that pain,
get over
collectively.
It. Get over it. Jesus saved us. Just preach the gospel. And it says, well, when we talk about abortion, we don't say just preach the gospel. Do we?
No, we do not.
So that's because white people and black people in this country have been traumatized by our lack of engagement of race.
That's the family story.
That's
our the family story.
And whether we like it or not, when you trust Jesus, we're family. Whether you like it or not. And we're family. And we can try to ignore and act like we're not a part of the same family. And God is such a good God that he will always make us have trails to one another. Always.
When I hear you say that, it makes me long for the church to go through the therapy, to get the counseling. Because think about what happened the last time the church leaned into the multi-ethnicity that God had intended, what that meant for the world. And I do think that there's a part of this moment that we're in where it may be that God wants to unleash. He wants to unleash the church. And, you know, we have this opportunity to focus on that or not.
The church is supposed to be a wounded healer.
I love that.
We're wounded healers. And so that's the beauty of being in Christ, is God always use you beyond your sanctification level. You're like, people think, I got to get to this point.
So beyond your maturity level, beyond how much Bible you know, beyond
anybody that God used greatly, it wasn't the way God used them never matched their maturity. It's impossible.
That's true for me.
Absolutely.
I'll put myself in the category.
It's impossible. And so and so places like this exist as a beacon of, first, for Black people, possibility, but also a stain in American history, particularly church history. A stain that this had to be created. It's not a stain for the people who created it.
No, it's beautiful.
It's the stain for the people who rejected it, but it's to remind us now moving forward, how do we let this be a reminder to never let this happen again? So that means, that doesn't mean now we start multi-ethnic churches that are led by majority culture people, and then we get Black people to be tokens, and what it does is it creates more wounds, because tokenism must have giftedness, not just people to be figureheads of color.
Yes.
Because that causes more damage if the person isn't theologically and practically qualified in what they're called to do, because that gives a mark for the people in majority culture to view ethnic minorities in a particular way, and then tokenism damages both both ethnic groups. And so that's why we have to continue to press in biblical freedom and engage in that reality in whatever ways we can, in relationships with one another, in relationship to God.
So how was that?
Oh man, that was so rich. Dr. Eric Mason, man, just a wealth of insight, and you know, there's so much he said that I'm still thinking about. But one of the things he talked about that just struck me was this whole idea of the church needing counseling for our collective family history. And man, it just reminds me that at every level, personally, but even in relationships and communities, like, we have to face our past. We've got to confront the truth about what's happened.
And it's like, without confronting that truth, we can't move on into what is actually the truth going to be of our future and our present. I like that, this idea of reckoning with something that, no, it doesn't hold us to standard of guilt. We aren't looking back so we can be guilty. We aren't looking back so we can be ashamed. We're looking back to deal with that thing that's holding us back from freedom. And you know, I think everyone has something in their life like that. You know, we talked about John chapter 8 and verse 32, but in verse 31, Jesus is actually talking to people that follow him. There's like this conditional prerequisite for being free, and it is being a follower of Jesus. It is accepting the gospel. It is saying, Jesus, you are Lord, and because of that, you've given me the power. And that really just means that when Jesus died, I love this, when Jesus died, he gave us something. He gave us that ability to be free, and all we got to do is accept that.
That's exactly
so that's the same for you, Chuck. That's the same for me. That's the same for you watching, that no matter where you are, no matter what you are, you can access to Jesus. And then he gives you that power to look at your past and say, what was there? What is this thing? Maybe it's present for some people right now. I know I got some present things that's trying to hold me back from true freedom. I can look at those things. I don't have to be afraid of them and say, look, Jesus qualified me as his son, as his daughter. I've accepted him, and because of that, I have access to that hope in verse 32. Is they shall know the truth. We already talked about that. And that truth, that can set me free. I'm pumped about that.
It will set you free. So one of the questions I think I'm asking coming out of this, I hope you're asking, what's the truth you've bound yourself to? What's the truth that you've bound yourself to? And how's that working for you, right? You know, like, there's some things that we haven't faced. There's some lies that we've been believing, and what Jesus invites us to do is bind ourselves to a deeper truth, a richer truth, a truth that really does make us free.
You know, Chuck, we are getting what we need in this series to be free. And If you joined us for this episode, I'm so glad you made it to the end, because you know what? There is more. Next time, we're gonna talk about how we get freedom when we surrender our choices and what that looks like. If you're interested, I want you to tune in to the next episode of the Freedom series.